Hola, buenas noches a todas y a todos. Les quiero presentar a Dr. K, psiquiatra de Harvard que se especializa en la salud mental de los jugadores de videojuegos. Él nos va a contar un poquito más de lo que él hace y su trabajo, así que muy contento de tenerlos a todos y bueno, a aprovechar esta gran charla. Así que los dejo con Dr. K.
Thank you very much. Me llamo Alok Kanojia. Hablo un poquito español, but not enough to give this talk. So you'll have to forgive me if I, speak in English. It's an honor to be here. And already I love the energy in the room, like seeing everyone's smiles and things like that. So I wanted to just outline a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll spend maybe about 40 to 50 minutes sort of lecturing and really going over some broad concepts and hopefully ending with some very, very practical tips. And the structure of my lecture is going to be, so I'm going to introduce myself for a minute and tell y'all a little bit about how I got here. And then I'd like to share with y'all what's happening in the video game industry, why we are seeing kids addicted to video games at a very, very high level, share some statistics about that. Then what I'd like to do is move from sort of a big picture, what's going on with video games, to understanding what's going on with the kids who play video games. So we're going to move a little bit more towards individual player psychology. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about parents and the relationship between parents and kids and why this is becoming so difficult. And we're going to talk a little bit about communication. And then last, we're going to spend a little bit of time on limit setting and sort of how to communicate limits and set healthy boundaries with your kid. So I'll just, and hopefully then we'll have plenty of time for questions, but I think that's usually what's going to be useful. One thing that I'll sort of point out is that each of the things that I'm going to be talking about, there's a lot more detail about that you can sort of dig into and try to understand. But generally speaking, I'd love to share our perspective and our approach to helping parents develop healthy relationships and help their kids conquer video game addiction. So to start out with, I am the son of Indian immigrants. My parents moved to the United States, and I was born in Texas, and I probably started playing way too many games very early on. So I was not very athletic in school. I was bullied a fair amount and found that other kids were faster, stronger, and better in terms of sports and things like that. So I sort of fell into video games. And I played a lot of video games, played too many video games, especially like in high school. So between the ages of about 12 and 18. And then I started college. And in my first year of college, almost failed many classes. And so was put on academic probation. And then next year really struggled to get my life in order. So I basically failed 2 years of college, primarily due to playing too many video games. And that's when my dad and I finally sat down one day, and my parents had tried everything. They'd tried being encouraging, giving me lots of love. They tried punishing me. They tried, talking to me, giving me guidance. They really tried everything that they knew how to do, and none of it was working. So my dad said, at some point, he just said when I was 20 years old and I'd failed 2 years of college, something needs to change, and I think you should go to India. So I decided to listen to him, and I went to India, and I spent 3 months at a monastery studying yoga and meditation, and actually decided at the age of 21 to become a monk. And so spent the next 7 years of my life studying yoga and meditation, really with the goal of becoming a monk. So I would spend summers in India, and then I still went back and finished my education and was planning on becoming a monk. But then I met my wife and fell in love, and then got super confused about what I was going to do. And ultimately decided to go to medical school. So that was a long and difficult process. For many, many years, I applied to medical school and didn't get in, applied to 160 medical schools year after year after year, and then finally ended up getting accepted to Tufts University School of Medicine, and then ended up doing my psychiatry training at Harvard Medical School, where I'm still faculty. While I was training to become a psychiatrist, I got kind of curious because I remembered that I had struggled a lot with video game addiction. But if you look at curriculums for psychologists or psychiatrists, almost all of them will have 0 hours of training in video game or technology addiction. And so I started asking my mentors, and these are very, very prominent people in the field of psychiatry, at least in the United States. And I'd ask them, what do you think about video game addiction? And none of them really knew much about it. And that's when it kind of hit me. If you look at the leaders in a particular field, how old do they tend to be, right? So the leaders in the field of psychiatry are going to be 50 years old, 60 years old, and none of them have ever like played a video game. Or if they played a video game, it's been a very, very minor experience. So this was sort of a new kind of thing that people didn't really have experience with. So that's where I started working with gamers and trying to help people who were basically younger versions of myself. Started in about 2015, and then eventually ended up starting this organization called Healthy Gamer. And instead of working in an office, we meet gamers where they're at. So we stream on Twitch. If y'all are familiar with what that is, it's a live streaming gaming platform. But now there's a psychiatrist who streams about mental health. We do interviews and things like that. We teach meditation. We also have a YouTube channel that has almost 1 million subscribers. And what we were very surprised, because it seemed like a lot of gamers who themselves were struggling were looking for help. Because the truth is, chances are your kids know that this is a problem. They know they should be getting better grades. They know they should be going to sleep on time. They know that they're spending too much time in front of a screen and they're not making friends. Maybe they're not making girlfriends or boyfriends. They know that their life is starting to be impacted. And generally speaking, the older that kids get, the more that they know that there's a problem. The challenge is that if you try to talk to them or you tell them, they'll resist, right? Because they're afraid of like giving ground. Because if I agree with mom and dad that I have a problem, that means that they're going to take the game away. So almost what it ends up becoming is like an antagonistic relationship, a relationship where it's you against your child, and the child wants the video game, and then it leads to conflict and things like that. So that's sort of my story, how we got here. And now what we've managed to do, we've now helped people in about 65 countries. We probably reach about 2 to 5 million gamers per month. Oftentimes they're the same gamers over and over again, so it's not a new batch. We have a coaching program, for example, where we support parents and we teach parents how to set healthy limits, how to understand gamers. We also have a course, which I understand there's going to be some giveaways and discount codes and things like that. So that's the kind of work that we do now. And so now let's sort of dive in, and I'd love the opportunity to share a little bit about what we've learned about video games, how they're changing, how they're affecting our kids, and what you can do about it. So let's start with how games are changing. So this is where the first thing to understand is like, it's hard to be a parent, because the challenges that y'all face, we face, I'm a father of 2, I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, are like different from what came before. I'm not saying that necessarily parenting is harder now than it used to be. I can't really say that, but I do know that parents have to worry about things that they didn't have to worry about 30 or 40 years ago. And that's their child getting addicted to technology. And so what's going on here? And this is where I want y'all to take a step back and think about the platforms that we use. So we have Google and we have Facebook and we've got YouTube and we have Instagram and like Twitter and all these different platforms, right? These platforms are spending millions or billions of dollars every year fighting for your attention. So YouTube wants you spending more time on YouTube than on Twitter. Twitter wants you spending more time on Twitter than on Facebook. This is how all the platforms work. They're all fighting over having you on their platform. And this is doubly true of video games. So to give you all a sense of the size of the video game industry, the video game industry worldwide is larger than the movie industry and the music industry put together. So you take every, concert sale ticket, every dollar that's spent on movies, subscription services, things like that, and every dollar that's spent on any form of music, you put those together and video games are way larger. And let's sort of think about this for a second, right? Like, because buying something like a PlayStation costs hundreds of dollars. And even buying a PlayStation is not enough, right? Then you have to buy a game. Here in the United States, they tend to run about $60. I'm not sure exactly how much they run in Chile, but this is where that's just the beginning of it. And then some of y'all are paying monthly fees to be able to play games. So the cost of games is like growing and growing and growing and growing. The other thing that's happening is game developers are getting smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter. So when I was growing up, you could beat a game. The game starts, you play it for a while, and then it ends. But if you look at games like, let's say, Fortnite, which used to be very popular, or Apex Legends, or these kinds of games, World of Warcraft is another one that's been very popular. These games never end, right? You can always play, always play, always play, and always spend more money, always spend more money. And so game developers are getting smarter and smarter. And what they're doing is they're trying to create the most addictive game. Because what they want your kid to do is play their game instead of playing one of their competitors' games. So if we think about it, we normally have different kinds of regulations for other kinds of addictive substances. We say that there's only a certain amount of nicotine you can put into cigarettes or e-cigarettes. There's only a certain amount of concentration that you can put in alcohol. And that's also a little bit different because if you literally drink too much, you're going to get sick and there's sort of these negative consequences. But with video games, there's no barrier on how addictive a game can be. And so what we're seeing is video game developers that are getting better and better and better at building more and more addictive games. So these are games that do not end. These are games that have more and more features. And if you think about it almost from like a capitalism standpoint, if I create a game and then someone else makes a game that is more engaging, more fun, right? That's what we sort of think about. Make a game that's more fun. What does that mean, more fun? That means that people enjoy playing it more. They spend more time playing it. And the more fun that they make it, they'll add some kind of new feature, like a loot box or some kind of community feature, or they add a different way to play. The more fun that they make it, the more people play that game. And the more people play that game, the better the game becomes, the more successful it is. Then what happens to everyone else in the industry? They all copy it, right? And so now we're seeing what happens if you look at something like battle royale genres like Fortnite or League of Legends, which is a MOBA genre. We're seeing all these features. So all it takes is one person to figure out how to make a game is more addictive. That video game becomes very, very successful. And then everyone else in the industry starts doing that. So suddenly all of the games have become more addictive. And then one person figures out something else. And then everyone else copies it. And all of the games are more addictive. So this is the situation that we're sort of facing, is that we have tons and tons of research and money going in by video game developers to essentially make their games more addictive. They employ psychologists, they employ behavioral economists, they employ psychiatrists, they employ even people who specialize in sort of like gambling behaviors. They'll employ like marketing and advertising folks. So they become very, very sophisticated. And they're sort of figuring out year after year how to make products more addictive. The challenge is that the support resources that we have, if you go to a psychiatrist or if you go to a psychologist, they can't keep up with the pace of other things. They can't keep up with the pace of video games. So even our understanding, so if you look at like the time it takes to do a clinical trial, it takes about 3 years. And so there are trials that are going now on Facebook, whereas nowadays, like everyone is using TikTok more. So the pace of technology is also moving faster than the pace of scientific research. And we're not really able to keep up. And even if you kind of think about it, like if y'all are teachers, I understand we have some people from schools here, and as your parents, you'll sort of notice that like over 10 years, there's been an explosion of video games, an explosion of technology. And now everyone is on their phone all the time. Just to give you all some statistics, back in the year 2000, between 2000 and 2010, about 5% of the population was addicted to video games. And that's kind of an interesting statistic. Just to give you an example, 6% of people worldwide are addicted to alcohol. So about as bad as alcoholism, maybe a little bit better. But there's a subtle thing about that statistic. That's 5% of the population worldwide. How many people in the year 2005 over the age of 40 do you think were addicted to video games? Almost none. So the younger you get, the higher that number actually is. Around 2020, that number has doubled to about 11%, especially in the population under the age of 18. About 98% to 99% of people under the age of 30 play some kind of video game. So this is a problem that's growing and growing and growing and getting worse by every year that goes by. And parents are left with this problem. So you go to you go to teachers, right? So this is awesome that a school is putting this together. But what a lot of parents will do is they'll go to teachers and they'll say, what do I do about this? Teacher says, I don't really know. You can even go to a mental health professional and you can say, what do I do about this? The mental health professional may offer you some advice, but most of them actually, like most of us, get no formal training in like how to deal with video game addiction. So this problem is getting worse and worse and worse, and people don't really know what to do about it. And parents are struggling because you see your kid playing this day after day after day after day. And you get worried about him. How are they, him or her? How are they going to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? Are they going to be doing their school properly? Are they becoming physically unhealthy? How are their social skills developing? You get worried about it, and like it sort of makes sense. So what's going on? Why are kids playing all these video games? So the tricky thing about a video game is the way that it addicts the brain is different from the way that a substance addicts a brain. So if you look at something like nicotine or alcohol or marijuana, there's a discrete biological compound that you ingest. It's like a unit, it's a molecule, and it will travel to particular parts of your brain and activate particular parts of your brain. These are usually what we think of as like reward circuitry. The challenge with video games is it's not a discrete compound. So it doesn't travel to one part of your brain and like turn it on right away. What it does is affects the brain more globally. And this is what we're seeing as games get more advanced. So I'll give you all a potential scenario. So not only is the game fun and kind of like activates my dopamine reward circuitry, but now games have a big social component. So every game has a friends list. You can play with friends. There are also platforms like Discord, which people will use to communicate with each other. They'll spend like kind of all day on Discord, right? So you start to form relationships with people in the virtual world. And so let's imagine a scenario of, let's say I'm a 15-year-old boy who's overweight and I've got bad acne, right? So I've got pimples and things like that. And I don't have a whole lot of confidence in myself. Maybe I don't have a whole lot of friends at school, but when I go on the game, like suddenly none of those things matter because I'm not overweight when I play a game. I don't have acne when I play a game. I'm just treated for the way that I am. So in a weird way, a lot of people who are struggling with bullying, even things like discrimination from a racial standpoint or things like that, on the video game, you're completely blind. And now what video games do is they offer you community. So it used to be that a video game was just fun, but now they offer you friendship. They offer you community. They offer you an antidote to loneliness. And so suddenly, like, the video game meets a psychological need that the child is not getting elsewhere. So there are a couple of other psychological needs which video games have sort of evolved to meet. So one is really interesting because it's this thing called the intent to mastery. So this is where, if you remember when your kids were learning to walk, right? When your child is first learning to walk, they fall down, and they fall down a lot. Why don't kids quit? Like, if you think about how much a child fails when they're learning how to walk, it's actually like ridiculous. They fail over and over and over again, day after day after day, and they don't quit. That's because there's a part of our brain that is wired to learn how to do stuff and keep trying and keep trying and keep trying until we get it right. And video games take advantage of this part of the brain. And this is why, if you kind of look at it, there's actually some really interesting research that shows that video games are addictive because of the denial of a reward. It's not that they just give you the reward, because if a game is very, very easy and you don't have to struggle, then people get bored of it. The most addictive games are the ones that actually deny the reward. So there's recently a game that came out, which is like, #1 on the sales charts and things like that. I don't know if people have heard of this game called Elden Ring. So this is a game that's developed by a developer called From Software, and the game is notoriously difficult. So when you try on a level and you beat it, and you try on a level and you beat it, and you try on a level and you beat it. You try on a level and you fail, and then you fail, and then you fail, and then you beat it the 4th time, your brain feels a sense of triumph. The problem is that part of your brain can't tell the difference between real life triumph and triumph in a video game. The reward that your brain gets is exactly the same. So even if we think a little bit about what do we respect as human beings, we don't respect someone who has everything easy for them. We respect people who achieve things that were difficult. So even in terms of my story, the fact that I failed and then became a doctor and then became a psychiatrist and all this kind of stuff, people respect me more because my path was difficult. So human beings in general, we always respect people who have struggles followed by triumph. And video games figured this out and they capitalize on this. So what happens is you've got a kid who's struggling in real life and they're triumphing in the video game. And so then what happens is their brain sort of has a choice on a daily basis. Do I want to live in the real world where I can try really hard and maybe like nothing will work out? Or do I want to focus on this video game? Because remember, at the end of the day, the difficulty in a video game is artificial because the game is designed to be beaten. It's supposed to make it artificially difficult for you. But at the end of the day, you will always win in the video game because that's the way it's made. A video game that is unbeatable. There's never been an unbeatable game. Or actually, I guess there have, but very few and far between. That's not usually what people play, right? So what happens in video games is that they actually take these fundamental psychological needs that we all have, and they've figured out over time how to satisfy more and more psychological needs. So it starts out with something simple as like a dopamine reward circuitry where everyone just has fun playing the game. And even if you think about if you play cell phone games and things like that, think about the colors in a cell phone game. Think about the sounds in a cell phone game. Think about the way that things pop, you know, how they're kind of bright and they give you this very satisfying sound, right? When you're playing these different kinds of cell phone games. And think about the way that the games prompt you, how they kind of pull you in to play more and more and more. And that has been an evolutionary process. They didn't start out that way. Someone made a black and white game like chess, right? So we all know what chess is. Or how many people are addicted to chess? Why are other games more addicting than chess? Chess has a lot of challenge, has a lot of difficulty, but chess is black and white. And the human eyes, we've been evolved to like color. We like movement. We like sound. We like pings. We like rewards. We like stars. And the game tells us, look, you got a trophy. You got a star. You did a good job. Play 6 more games to get another star. Whereas chess doesn't give you any of those kinds of rewards. So it starts with dopamine reward circuitry. And over time, what games have done is they've figured out how to evolve into taking advantage of other parts of our brain. So one is the intent to mastery. This is sort of the sense of triumph where I get to like conquer something in a video game. And there's a part of my brain that doesn't know the difference. There is a part of my brain that knows. So if I'm 25 years old and I spend all day playing a video game, even though the video game rewards me at the end of the day, when I turn off the video game, I know the difference. I know I'm wasting my life. The problem is that it's so damn addictive that I can't do anything about it. So there's this sort of triumph circuit that it involves. Another thing that it does is it builds community. So just to give you all an example, I started playing a particular online video game called StarCraft at the age of 12, and I met a friend online. We continued to play video games for the next 8 or 9 years, and we were very, very close. We never met in person. Many, many years later, when I was 27 years old, I was getting married. And when I got married, I invited him to my wedding. I never met the guy. He's one of my best friends. So the tricky thing is that the relationships we form online are real. There's like an aspect that there's a real human being on the other side of the internet, right? And they know you, that you talk to them every day, you get to know them a little bit. And so these relationships are real, and video games take advantage of that. They make it easy for you to connect with people. They facilitate communication. And so the more that you have a community within the video game, people will hang out with their friends by playing the game. They won't even play. I don't know if you guys know what idling is. It means sitting in the game, but not even playing, where people will do that. They'll just hang out, like on an online server, just voice chatting and sort of hanging out. The last thing that we've got to talk about in terms of how video games take advantage of brains has to do with emotional suppression. So any kind of addiction, one of the key ways that it works is by suppressing negative emotions in our brain. So we have this part of a brain called the amygdala and the limbic system, which is where we experience negative emotions. So if I'm having a bad day and I have a couple of drinks, that part of my brain basically calms down. And video games have been shown through functional MRI imaging studies. These are studies that look at blood flow to different parts of the brain, that when you play a video game, they shut off your experience of negative emotion. So if I'm having a bad day and I start to play a video game, it basically kind of turns that part of my brain off. The problem is that oftentimes when I have negative emotions, those emotions are things that I use to build forward momentum to fix things in life. If I look at myself in the mirror and I say, I'm out of shape, that negativity, that sort of, shame I feel in myself could actually push me to start exercising. The problem is with a video game, it sort of artificially shuts it off. And then as soon as the video game ends, the emotion comes back. And so people get stuck in this cycle where, just like alcohol or marijuana or opiates in severe cases, video games become a crutch to manage our emotions. So I have to forget. And that's something that I remember very well when I was in college and failing out of college. I knew I was failing out. And I knew that every day that went by, my grades were getting worse and worse and worse because I was skipping class. And so the more I skip class, the more I have to play video games to forget. And then what I would do is play until 4 a.m, 5 a.m, 6 a.m. I had to play until I was so tired that I did not stay awake at all as soon as I laid down. Because what would happen is if I didn't fall asleep right away, the guilt would come up. The shame would come up. I'm ruining my life. I'm ruining my life. I'm ruining my life. And those thoughts were so incredibly painful that I had to play until I was on the verge of passing out. And then I would pass out the next day. That night. And then I'd wake up the next day. I'd feel all those negative feelings and I would turn on the game to make them go away. And that's how I failed even my introductory Spanish class, which is part of the reason I'm giving the talk in English. Because I imagine if I had passed that class, maybe I would speak a little bit more Spanish today. So that's what that's what video games do to our brain and sort of how they act on your child. And so now we're going to get to communication. So it's our belief at Healthy Gamer that the best way to help your child overcome video games is through communication and building an alliance. Because if you're overcoming an addiction, the person who is addicted can't be fighting against you. I can try as hard as I want to as an addiction psychiatrist, but unless the person who's actually addicted wants to give up alcohol, they have to want to give up alcohol. You can't force someone to do it. Otherwise, they will find a way. You can get them to stop for a little while. You can get them to stop for a long while. But if they want to drink alcohol, if they want to smoke marijuana, if they want to play video games, they will find a way. And what happens is that as parents, we don't really know what's going on. We get frightened, right? Because we sort of see that my son is ruining their life. Adjust the lighting in here for a second. That'll help. The glare. So as we see our child ruining their life. As we get afraid, as we get worried, we talk to them. And then these are children that we've raised from, infancy. For the mothers out there, these are children that grew inside you. They're attuned to your emotions. And when you talk to them and you're terrified about how they're ruining their life, and you have a conversation with them that is built on fear, they get scared too. And when they get scared, they panic and they kind of push you away. And the more frightened they get, the more they turn to the video game, because that's how they calm down their negative emotions. So a big part of this is communication. And so what we sort of recommend is, first of all, talk to your kid about why they play the video game. And this is what's so terrifying for the child. So the child doesn't want to have a conversation with you. Why? Because where is this conversation going? Conversations between parents and kids about video games end up with punishment, right? That's usually where the conversation goes. You're going to start by maybe asking them some questions, but they know that you want them to stop playing. They know that you're going to try to trick them into something, or maybe you'll punish them or something like that. So they don't even want to talk to you. And as long as you're not able to communicate with your child, it's very, very difficult or almost impossible to overcome video game addiction. So what we sort of recommend is, first, as parents, talk to your kids. For the first month, talk to them once a week at a minimum for 1 hour. But don't take their games away. Don't adjust their gaming at all. You have to get them talking to you. And what you want to do as a parent is try to understand why they play video games. Because oftentimes, remember that video games are used as an emotional calming technique. So there may be other things in your child's life that you're not aware of that causes them to retreat to the game. So maybe they're getting bullied at school. Maybe they have problems with self-esteem. Maybe they're struggling with anxiety or depression or ADHD or something like that. Because remember, they're using the video game to get rid of some kind of negative emotion. So what is that negative emotion? And when I work with gamers, what I really try to do is help them build a life that is worth living. The ultimate antidote to video game addiction is having a life that rewards you more than the video game. And the second that starts to happen, you've conquered the addiction. Even now, I still play games. I was addicted so bad I failed out of college. I still play games. I played an hour and a half of video games today between my normal work time and this talk, right? But at the end of the day, this matters to me more than the game. Recognizing that there are parents out there, that this is my life's work, that there are kids out there who are struggling. And boy, I wish there was someone who could talk to my parents so that my parents understood how to help me better. And that's way more important to me than playing any video game. So you've got to talk to your kids and ask them, what does this game do for you? So they may use the game as an antidote to loneliness. They may use a game as a sense of like trying to become, successful because they like who they are in the virtual world. They don't like who they are in the physical world. And this is the other thing. I don't know if y'all have heard of esports or pro gaming or streaming, right? But maybe like you think, oh, you're playing these video games and you're ruining your life. You won't go to college. You won't be able to find a job. And your kid is thinking, I don't need a job. I'm going to become a streamer. I'm going to become a pro gamer. You think that I'm ruining my life, whereas this is actually going to be my career. So I need your help, actually, because you want me to be successful. This is how I'm going to be successful. So you don't really know until you sort of like understand why your child is playing the video game. You're not going to have a good reason, because the reason that you want to use to get them to stop is not your reason, right? It's actually got to be their reason. And that's true in addiction psychiatry in general. So I'd love to tell you all a story. When I was like a medical student, I had a patient who smoked cigarettes. And I was like a medical student. I was so smart, right? Because they teach you so many things in medical school. I learned all these statistics about lung cancer and heart disease. So in walks my patient, who's a 40-year-old man. And I tell them, sir, I think you should stop smoking. And he's like, yeah, you're right. I should really stop smoking. And I was like, okay, do you know what happens if you continue smoking? He's like, no, I don't. I was like, let me educate you. I'm a medical student. Let me tell you, your chances of lung cancer are going to be 300% higher. You're going to get heart disease, all this kind of stuff. Do you want lung cancer, sir? No, I don't want lung cancer. And I was like, great. So you're going to stop, right? And he's like, yes, absolutely. Thank you. You're going to be a wonderful doctor one day. Great. A month later, he comes in. Do y'all think he's still smoking? Absolutely. I say, oh my God, this guy doesn't understand. Okay, let me tell him more. Hey, sir, do you know what smoking is going to do to you? He's like, yeah, you explained it, lung cancer. Well, it's worse than that. Did you know that smoking makes you more likely to have a stroke? Do you want a stroke? No, I don't want a stroke. So why don't you quit smoking? Great idea. I'm going to quit smoking. So comes back a month later. Has he quit yet? Absolutely not. So I'm kind of confused by this, right? So I talked to my supervisor, who's a medical doctor, and then I talked to him. He's like, why don't you get to know the guy? Like, try to understand who he is as a person. Because information about consequences does not change behavior. So I get to know him. Okay, tell me a little bit about yourself. He's got 2 daughters, right? One is 12. One is, I think, 8 or something like that. So he's got 2 daughters and he loves his daughters. He's really, really happy. He wants to have, do you want grandkids one day? Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait till I have grandkids. And that's when I ask him, I'm still learning this kind of stuff. So that's when I ask him, when you walk your daughter down the aisle, do you want to be wheeling an oxygen tank behind you? And then he's like, no. It's like, do you ever want to meet your grandkids? Right? Do you want to be able to play with your grandkids outside? Do you want to be able to teach them football? So back then I was like kind of rusty at this, and that's probably a bit too cruel, but it got to the point, which is that like, what matters to you and like, what kind of life do you want? What physical condition do you want to be when you have grandkids? Do you want to be able to play with your grandkids? Or do you want to be sitting in a chair using a wheelchair with, an oxygen mask on? And that's when we started to make a little bit of progress. I had to learn a lot about compassion and being nice, like being like a good doctor. And so that's what we do now. We meet kids where they're at. And you have to align things with their objectives, because like that if they continue playing these games, it's going to be a problem when they're 30 years old. They may have difficulty supporting themselves financially. They may have difficulty developing romantic relationships. You know all this stuff, but like your 15-year-old has no idea. They have no idea what it's like to pay bills. They have no idea how expensive it is to raise a kid. They have no idea, what it's like to have a loving relationship. They don't even know what they're missing. And you can't scare them into it. So what you've got to do is talk to them. So for the first month, 1 hour a day, sit them down or even ask for permission. Say, hey, I'm going to give you all some language here. I'd love to talk to you about and try to understand why you play games. Like, I just like to understand, what does it mean to you? Why do you do this sort of thing? And this is where what we'll discover is, like, as you talk to them and you listen, you're not going to try to get them to stop playing or anything like that. That's really not part of the goal here. It's really to just listen and try to understand, like, what's going on with your kid and what is this game doing for you? And that's when you can start to ask questions at the end of the first month. Do you have any concerns about this game? Do you have any concerns about, like, do you have any concerns? And that's where you got to be careful, because you don't want to, how can I say this? You don't want to pretend that your opinion is a question. Okay. So this is a little bit weird, but you don't want to ask a question like, do you think maybe you could be ruining your life a tiny bit? That's an opinion. It's not a question, right? So if the purpose of a question is not to make a point, it's to learn. That's why we ask questions. And if you have a particular belief, you should just share it. So you can say to your child, I'm concerned about the direction that your life is going. What do you think about that? And then just listen. And it's like magic. If y'all want to, you can even watch our interviews and just watch how we talk to gamers and stuff like that. And just like becoming an effective communicator. So a big part of the program that we have is in literally learning like communication skills, because talking to gamers is a little bit different. There are all kinds of problems that you can run into in terms of resistance, right? They're terrified, but like telling someone that they're ruining their life doesn't actually inspire them to change. If you want to create positive change, generally speaking, fear is not a good motivating emotion. And that's where, like with the patient that I had, terrifying him into like, oh, you're going to get lung cancer and all this kind of stuff is not the right move. It's about, what do you care about? And when you can align things with what you care about, that's when you'll see positive change. And that all comes with a conversation, lots of conversations. What do you want from life? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? Let's talk about that. What does the game do for you? What do you like about the video game? And oftentimes what we'll discover is the tools that we need to develop a plan to overcome the addiction. So I'll give you all an example from a parent who went through our program. So what he sort of really discovered was that his child was sort of ashamed of their life, and he really wanted to build confidence, and he wanted to get physically healthy. And so as they talked about lots of different options. So like, what can you do? What can I do to help you sort of build confidence? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And then eventually what they settled on is martial arts class, because the kid wanted to learn martial arts. It's like cool to like be able to defend yourself. You build confidence in yourself. You become like physically capable. If you get bullied, which this child was getting bullied, you can defend yourself if you need to. So the kid was really, really excited about that. And then the parent asked him a really important question. So we're going to start martial arts class next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Tuesday at 4 p.m. If you tell me that you don't want to go, do you want me to force you? And the kid said, absolutely. And now you have the excuse. Now something is subtly different. By asking that question, normally they say they want to do something, and then you're pushing them to do it and they're fighting you. But when you ask them, you tell it's their choice. I can force you or not force you. What do you want me to do as your parent? And that's when they start working with you. And it's those kinds of questions that alter the nature of your relationship, because now both of y'all are working towards it together. Okay. So that's why like communication is a key part. And your child has to learn that a conversation with you isn't necessarily going to end in punishment or some kind of like game being taken away. They need to be able to tell you, I'm worried about the game, without you using that as ammunition to take their game away. See, you told me you're worried, so no more games. They need you to be able to like listen to them and like build that kind of trust, and then help kind of work with them to sort of set goals that they can get behind. And once you start moving in that direction, that's when we start to see positive change. So once you've established that communication, then the natural question is, it's not so easy after that, right? It's not like, oh, we're done. Like now they're going to listen to me all the time and it's perfect. No, then there's a lot of stuff that you have to do as a parent around boundary setting and limit setting. So there are a couple of tips that we have about boundary setting and limit setting. The first is don't set a boundary and enforce a boundary at the same time. So I'll give you guys an example of what that means. So let's say it's 10 o'clock. It's your kid's bedtime. You go up to their room and you say, no more games after 10 o'clock. At 10 p.m., you're going to end up with a fight because you're giving them the rule and enforcing the rule at the same time. So what we want to do is separate out establishment of the rule with enforcement of the rule. They shouldn't happen at the same time. So you're going to talk to them Monday morning and say, okay, like when's good, like, bedtime is at 10 o'clock. You're supposed to stop playing games by 10. And that's where you can even ask them certain questions. I don't know like how familiar you are, but you can even ask them questions. If you're in the middle of a game and it's 10 o'clock, what am I going to do? Am I going to let you finish the game? Or am I going to like turn off the computer or unplug the internet? Like what's your expectation? And you want to make it crystal clear ahead of time. So if you don't want to get interrupted in the middle of a game, because your kid may tell you what's really important to me is like not getting interrupted and finishing a game. Okay, I get it. So I'm not going to interrupt you and finish a game, but then you need to stop by 9:15. Okay. So you want to sort of let them know ahead of time what the boundary is. This is also where it's really important as a parent to set that boundary with their input. So this is something that a lot of parents don't realize, but there's a lot of dimensions around gaming. So you can even tell your kid, I'm totally fine with you playing games, but these things need to happen. You need to wake up on time and you need to get certain grades and you need to like exercise or play football or like do a couple of other things. And if you can manage all those things, you can play games. So I want to know what's more important to you. Do you want to stay up till 2 a.m. on Friday night and play as long as you want to, and then wake up late on Saturday? Or do you want a limit? Like, do you want a limit on weekly gaming and then you can play as much as you want to? Maybe I'll order pizza for you. I'll get you whatever food you want. You let them sort of pick which dimension of the game that they restrict. So you may have certain things that you're not willing to compromise on, but then you have to kind of give some and take some. And there may be dimensions that they're okay with. Like they may really like it if they get to play as long as they want to on Friday night. Because instead what's happening right now is you're bugging them all the time. You're bugging them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You're bugging them all the time. They're not really listening. And so like it never goes well. So you can sort of recruit them a little bit in terms of what dimension of the boundary you want to set. So do you want to play unlimited amount of time on Saturday? Or do you want like 2 hours a day? Or like, what do you want? 1 hour a day? Like, let them have some control so they'll tell you what's important to them. And that way you'll get some buy-in and you'll get a little bit less resistance. So you want to sort of set that boundary and let them know about the boundary multiple times. So you remind them, hey, so we talked about it on Friday, starting today on Monday, games end at 10 p.m. Right? I just want to make sure you remember that. The other thing to be really careful about is sometimes parents will reinforce the wrong things. So I'm going to give you all a scenario, okay? Let's say that my kid gets really, really upset and throws a temper tantrum. And to calm them down, I give them the iPad. What is that actually teaching the child to do? How does it get the iPad? So this is something that a lot of parents do with kids. It's like the kid says, can I have the iPad? I say no. They say, please. I say no. Please, no. Then they start throwing a temper tantrum. And then I give them the iPad. So actually what I'm teaching the kid in that moment is the more you throw a temper tantrum, the more you're going to get the iPad. So over time, what the child does is starts throwing more and more temper tantrums. We see this as well for kids who are addicted to video games because parent says bedtime is 10 p.m. and then you go to sleep because you're a parent. You got a lot of stuff to do. You're tired. How are you supposed to stay up past 10? So then you go to sleep and then they play till 11, midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. And so what are you teaching them about your words? Do they have to listen to your words? What happens if they ignore your words? Nothing. You're actually teaching them, training them to ignore what you say. So that's where in terms of parents, because a lot of times the limits that we set for kids are what we want, not actually what we can enforce. So this is where the second tip that we sort of give you is don't set a limit that you can't enforce. Start with a very, very small limit and enforce that 100%. So that's where you have to be a little bit careful, because what your child needs and what you can actually enforce may be two very separate things. So that's why, like, don't set a limit that you can't enforce, because all that's going to do is teach them to ignore your words. So that's sort of the second tip about boundary setting. So don't enforce and set the limit at the same time. Second thing is, don't set a limit that you can't enforce. And this is where a lot of times we run into a lot of problems if there's like split households where, kid is staying with mom some days, dad some days, because dad may do something and then mom may not do it and things like that. That's where you get into a lot of trouble. The last tip in terms of boundary enforcement, let me think about this. We talked about don't set and enforce at the same time. Don't set limits that you can't enforce. Oh yeah, the third thing is don't set a limit when you yourself are upset. So if you are upset when you set a limit, chances are the limit is going to be harsher and more difficult to enforce. So this is a huge part of our program, is you yourself need to calm your emotions before you have these conversations and before you set limits. So like as a parent, you have to acknowledge how stressful this is for you. And so like once you calm down, once you have a clear head, because if you're really, really upset, you're like, no more games after 10 p.m., but you don't even think about, oh, I'm working late on, Tuesday and Thursday. I'm at the hospital until midnight. That's an impossible boundary to enforce. And so what you're teaching your kid is like, they don't have to listen to what you say. So you yourself need to calm yourself down. Also in terms of your fear, your concern for your child, your love for your child, you need to make sure that that's kind of like processed and in a good place before you sit down and talk to them. So be really careful about your own emotions. So this is where a lot of parents are like really confused originally with our program, because they'll say things like, my kid is the one who needs your help. I don't need your help. My kid is the one who needs to be in your program. My kid is the one with the problem. That's where we say, pardon us, but we beg to differ. You're the one that needs to be in our program because you're the adult. And you could try to send them our way, but if the kid doesn't want to be here, we don't want him. And so oftentimes what we'll do is equip parents. And the other cool thing is that if you think about, how do kids like create these kinds of problems? It's because you love them. That's why they win. Anytime there's a conflict, why do they win? Because you love them. What does that mean, because you love them? It's because you can't tolerate, or some of y'all, me included, it's very difficult to have our kids dislike us, right? We love them. We want them to be happy. We want them to like us. So what we end up doing is like we let our emotions get the better of us. When we set a limit that's hard to enforce in the kid, we feel guilty. They get mad at us. And then like we feel bad. So we let them kind of get away with it. And then we take back our words. We don't enforce the limit. And it sort of like ends up being a difficult scenario. And then they know how to like emotionally manipulate us, which kids are great at. That's how we're wired. Right? So manage your own emotions in terms of boundary setting. And some of that also involves setting a boundary that you understand is going to upset your child and being able to tolerate that kind of thing. So at the end of the day, our approach, just to kind of summarize, is first of all, understand video games. Secondly, understand your kid. Understand all the things that your game does for your child. Because chances are taking their game away is not just taking their game away. In their mind, it's way more than a game. It's a potential career. It's a source of community. It's my friends. It's the people who care about me. And you're sentencing them to real life, which they don't like. So understand why your child plays the game. Communicate with them. Build a therapeutic alliance. Build an alliance with your kid. For 1 month, try talking to them. Try and get to know them. Why do you play the game? What do you like about it? Help me understand. And then you can have a conversation with them. Here's the situation I'm in as your parent. I understand these are your friends. I understand you want to be pro, but there's some things that I really think are not acceptable. Like, what if you don't go pro? And like, you still need to, form healthy relationships. You need to wake up on time. How can we figure out how you can play the game and do these kinds of things, and at the same time also accomplish what you should basically accomplish as a child? So have a conversation with them and then go to limit setting. Get their input for limit setting. Set limits and boundaries outside of enforcement. Set them way ahead of time so they know what's coming. When you enforce, make sure that everyone understands what's going on ahead of time. The other thing to consider is don't set boundaries when you're emotional. So like the more emotional you are, the worse the boundary setting is going to get. And so you need to process your own emotions before you kind of like set that boundary. So that's sort of the prepared portion that I have. I know we covered a lot of material. There's a lot more to cover, don't get me wrong. But I think that's really a useful overview, hopefully. And now we'll open it up to questions.
Okay,
Muchas gracias, doctor K, ¿no, verdad? Para decirlo completamente en español por la presentación. Ahora vamos a abrir un espacio de preguntas y lo que vamos a hacer es que por favor escriban sus preguntas en el chat. Y tenemos a Fernanda que nos va, Mónica. Entonces,
Olivia nos va a ayudar. Olivia está lista ya.
Olivia y Mónica están, esto es una... es verdad, nos vamos, pero porque es que todos quieren que el otro participe. Estamos pensando en los demás, como explicó muy bien doctor K, que hay que pensar en nuestros hijos, ponernos en el lugar del otro, para poder entender bien la situación y poder dar la pregunta. Acuérdense, nosotros pensamos la respuesta, pero hay que focalizarnos en la pregunta, como le explicó. Vamos entonces con las preguntas. Olivia, te dejo ahí donde ahí vas escogiendo, te pedimos que vayas leyendo mientras yo ahí te introduzco y vas entregando al doctor la pregunta, y les invitamos nuevamente a todos. Ahí ya vi que hay algunas. Por favor, Olivia.
Sí, voy a leer las preguntas, están escritas en inglés, así que las voy a leer en inglés. What about a teenager with HDAD and executive dysfunction can't establish goals?
Great question. So video games actually synergize with ADHD in a very unhealthy way. So if we think about the ADHD mind, it has difficulty focusing. And so video games can be like very, very easy or stimulating for people with ADHD. We see there's a very, very high comorbidity between video game addiction and ADHD. So this is where it's a little bit tricky, but your challenge is going to be objectively harder because the game is going to accommodate the ADHD in the way that the rest of life will not. So this is where oftentimes what we really have to do is get really solid treatment for ADHD. And the two have to be sort of tackled together. So in psychiatry, we call this dual diagnosis, where oftentimes we'll see this with, for example, depression and alcohol use, where you can be depressed, and in order to manage your feelings of depression, you'll drink the alcohol. So the depression causes people to drink more alcohol. But if they're drinking too much alcohol, that can cause them to be depressed. So the two really have to be tackled at the same time. And so you're really going to need good ADHD treatment and sort of recognize that it's just going to be like, honestly, harder, which I wish I could say there was a simpler way, but honestly, it's just harder, which doesn't mean that it isn't solvable. Oftentimes it's the people with ADHD. How can I say this? The reason they play the video game is because ADHD makes the rest of their life hard. And so your kid wants to succeed in life. And so the cool thing is that if you really treat that ADHD, you're giving them a path to like engage in life and be successful. You're taking away one of the roadblocks, one of the obstacles that is hard for them. And so they can oftentimes get really behind it. Like they can, you know, if you really have a good, compassionate, comprehensive plan that sort of includes ADHD treatment, they can really get on board. So we've seen a lot of success with it. And it's like, honestly, it's just harder.
Okay, I have another one. What if, besides communicating with my son, I also try to play and understand the game? Maybe it can help to engage and then talk, knowing what they actually do.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's totally fine to play games with your kids. I also see the next question is it healthy to play video games with our kids? But there's one key thing. Don't assume that playing games is a substitute for anything else. So oftentimes what parents will do is they'll think like, oh, if I play the game with them, the kid will like it. And I'll show them, see, I'm playing a game. Then they'll listen to me more. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. What's going to get them to listen to you more is you understanding them. That's the most important thing. So if you think about, your experiences with medical professionals, who's the doctor that you trust? The doctor that understands you. So playing a game with the kid can be a very, very healthy way to understand their world. It can be your demonstration that, hey, I'm really trying to understand you. See, I'm playing this game. It can also be a fun way to bond. Like I play games with my kids. So it can be all of those things, but be super careful that it's not going to be a substitute for communication. It's not going to be a substitute for healthy boundary setting. It's not going to actually make it easier for you to set limits on them. I don't think so anyway. So it's like a useful piece, but don't think that it's worth more than it is, if that kind of makes sense. Great question.
The following ones are in Spanish, so I'll read them in Spanish. Si un niño no quiere jugar, pero hay otros niños de carácter más fuerte que lo obligan o lo presionan, ¿cómo se maneja eso?
It's a great question. So one of the things that we've really found is very effective is that setting a limit on your kid, it's a little bit different from this question, but I'll explain. Setting a limit on your kid when all of their friends at school don't have the same limit is very hard. So this is where parents need to communicate with other parents. And everyone needs to sort of get on the same page. And then it's going to be way easier. So if all of the parents can agree, okay, no more playing games after 10 p.m., then all of the kids, because what the kid will say is they'll say, oh, like, I don't know why you do this. So-and-so's mom and dad let him play until midnight. So you should do that for me too. And what they'll kind of do is like, they'll be really, really upset if their friends are able to play and they're not able to play. What this question is almost the opposite, that your kid doesn't really want to play, but they feel pressured. That's exactly why we want to have a conversation, right? So we want to understand, okay, so it turns out that you actually don't want to play, but you feel pressured and the kids are kind of bullying you into playing. How can we help you set limits with those kids? Or how can we help you build friendships or relationships outside of this friend group? And that's a very, very good diagnostic thing to understand as a parent, because now you understand my child is bullied into playing video games. So how can I help them maybe do something extracurricularly after school, spend time with like other groups of people, facilitate building relationships outside of the toxic group of friends? It's a beautiful question because you sort of know the reason why your child is playing so that you can attack the root of the problem, which is that my kid has the wrong friend group. And once you can help them build the healthy friend group, it'll be easier to get them to stop playing the game. Great question.
¿Hay una mayor tendencia a la adicción en niños que en niñas? Y si es así, ¿por qué?
Yeah, there's absolutely a higher addiction rate between boys than girls. So I don't know exactly what the statistics are. I think between 2000 and 2010, it was maybe 85 to 90% boys. That gap is quickly shrinking. So every year that goes by, the difference is less. There are a couple of different reasons for this. The first is that boys tend to have frontal lobes that develop more slowly than girls, oftentimes 1 to 2 years behind during like early stages of development. And frontal lobes are responsible for things like impulse control. So oftentimes we sort of have this sense that girls are like a little bit more conscientious or a little bit more proper than boys. Like you can kind of like, a 5-year-old girl can pack their bag, whereas a 5-year-old boy may not be able to. And so there is a neuroscientific difference between the two. Games are also more culturally targeted towards boys, but that too is rapidly changing. And so what we're sort of seeing is that there is that kind of difference. There may be some neuroscientific basis, but culturally things are shifting very rapidly. Now I think 30 to 40% of people who are addicted to video games are now women or girls. Great question.
Okay, here comes another one. Si mi hijo rinde bien en el colegio, es sociable, cariñoso y le gusta mucho la tecnología y con ello los videojuegos, ¿cómo buscar un balance entre su mundo real y virtual? Tengo la percepción de que no juega para apagar emociones negativas, sino para tener desafíos más entretenidos que en la vida real.
Yeah, so if I just want to make sure I understood the question correctly. This is a situation where a kid is doing okay in real life, but also is playing video games and how to balance that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'd say this is where have a conversation with them, right? So I'd say like, that's the foundation of it. So, hey, I've noticed that you play a lot of games and also that like you're doing pretty good in school. Like you've got friends and things like that, because that's what's happened is gaming has become a part of the normal fabric of childhood. So that's where I'd start with a conversation with them and then also ask them like questions like, do you have concerns about the amount of games that you play? Right? And if they have some concerns about it, that's totally fine. And if they don't, you can also have questions. You can share your concerns. So I worked with a 15-year-old kid that was very, very talented, very smart, did very well in school, also was a competitive rower. So did, like rowing. And so his parents were really concerned about his gaming because he wasn't really messing anything up, but he was just like playing too much. As they talked to him and he's like, well, I'm 15 years old. It's like my job to have fun. And this is how I have fun. And so over time, what they really found is actually that the kid was bored by his classes. His classes were too easy. We do also see video game addiction more with more intelligent kids. And there's a really interesting principle there, which is how quickly does a school move? How quickly does the class move? Oftentimes it moves at the pace of the slowest kid, or it moves at the pace of the average kid. And so what happens is a video game is different. When you beat level 1, what's waiting for you? Level 2. If you beat level 2, what's waiting for you? Level 3. So very intelligent kids, interestingly enough, can get even more addicted to games because it actually provides them with a challenge, whereas like regular life may not. So interestingly enough, our solution with this kid was to give him an internship at a artificial intelligence startup. So at 16 years old, we dropped him in an internship in an AI startup. And then he was sufficiently challenged. He loved it. For 3 months, he felt like really engaged in the summer and things like that. So that's where the goal here is like conversation, right? Try to understand, okay, what do you think about the balance? Let's think a little bit about how to maintain balance. Are there other things that is there something that you're getting from the video game? Because you said excitement is what they're getting from the video game, right? That's what this kid got from the AI startup is like, it's kind of exciting. Like this is cool stuff. So he was working at a company, really cool company that takes a picture of moles like on your skin and uses artificial intelligence to tell you the likelihood that the mole is cancerous. Is it a benign mole or a cancerous mole? And that's cool to do, like as a 16-year-old. Like being involved with that is like super exciting. So he really liked it. And I think it's still about conversation. And then if you're concerned about it, trying to offer alternatives that your kid can be excited about.
I'm going to mix two questions now because there are a lot of parents asking, when can you consider addiction? And together with that, how much is healthy gaming at different ages? For example, 10 years old, 15 years old, or at what age could you start gaming? Because what happens when parents share games at 6 or 7 years old? So
great, fantastic questions. So let's answer the first question. When is it an addiction? So that's where we have a very simple standard, at least in the United States, which is that if it causes a problem, it is a problem. So it's not 2 hours or 4 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours. It's how does it impact the rest of your life? If it impacts your academic function, if it impacts your professional function, if it impacts your relationships, if it impacts your physical health, if it impacts your mental health, if it impairs function, then we say it crosses the line into addiction. So that's like, in a sense, it's simple, but it's not a straight answer because oftentimes parents are looking for how many hours should I restrict? Well, it's not really like that, unfortunately. Second thing is that in terms of what's healthy for kids, I'd say that firmer limits for younger kids is more important. So just to give you all kind of a rule of thumb, I let my kids at most spend on average half an hour using a screen a day. But it's not a screen every day. It's usually like if they want to spend 2 hours watching a movie on the weekend, that's fine, but we're going to go like 2 days without screens. So we try to sort of limit it to half an hour a day. That also requires a lot more effort as a parent. So this is where like a lot of times like single parent households, it's just tough. Like, let's be honest, like it's really hard to manage your kids without screens, right? And that's also where what I do is I really recommend teaching restraint instead of restriction. So I'll also have a lot of conversations with my kid about when you watch for 1 hour, like, how do you feel afterward? Do you end up getting crankier? Do you end up fighting more? Let's pay attention. Let's watch for half an hour and then stop and then see how you feel and whether you can do something fun afterward. And then 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later, I'll ask them, are you having fun painting? Yeah, I am. Is it okay that we stopped the iPad? Yeah, it's fine. And when you kind of have these sorts of conversations with younger kids about demonstrating insight, that goes a long way. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of parents think about restricting time, but it's not just time. So this is where not all screen time is the same. Some games are worse than others. Some even YouTube things or shows are worse than others. So here's another thing to consider. Long form content is better than short-term content, short form content. So things like TikToks or 1-minute videos that your kid watches, 30-second memes, things like that. There are these YouTube compilations that are meme compilations. And those meme compilations are actually worse than a long form piece of equipment, long form thing. And so this is where what I really am, I'm good. What you really want to do is be careful about what kind of thing they watch, because when they watch lots of short-term stuff, that actually shortens their attention span and moves them closer to ADHD. So it's not just how much they watch, it's also what kind of thing they do. One last thing to consider is also what is the online environment for the games that they play. So sometimes what you'll have is like, voice chat where people are very toxic. They'll be like, older people, like 30-year-old men living with their parents that don't have a job and things like that, are very resentful towards life and all this kind of stuff. So you've got to be careful too, because some games are more violent. Some games are more, multiplayer focused. So it's also what the kind of thing that they kind of watch.
And together with that, is there, looking from the other side, is there anything positive of video games for the brain, or more than entertainment,
100%. So it's a great question. So part of the reason that I started Healthy Gamer is because I think you can be a healthy gamer. So if we think about a lot of addiction, we think about abstinence, right? So if I'm an alcoholic, I can never have a drink again. If we look at the behavioral addictions, let's say something like shopping addiction or sex addiction or video game addiction, the goal here, at least in my mind, is not abstinence only, right? So you should still be able to have a healthy sexual relationship. You should still be able to purchase things, right? Including clothes and groceries and stuff like that. It's okay to buy stuff. It's just about setting limits. So the cool thing is that there are some positive effects of video games. There's some evidence. The United States Department of Defense did a study on soldiers who play video games and found that soldiers who play video games have a 20% higher fluid IQ. So this is a part of intelligence that involves problem solving in novel situations. So it's not like, it's sort of like if you give someone a new situation and ask them to figure things out, apparently gamers are good at that. And it sort of makes sense because in a video game, each game you play, the rules change. You have to figure out how to succeed in the rules. Other thing is that the social connections from video games are very legitimate. So for every person that I've met who said video games are ruining my life, I've also met one person who said, if it wasn't for video games, I would have committed suicide a long time ago. If we look at kids who grow up in abusive environments, kids who grow up with parents who have substance use problems, the video game can be a healthy escape when nothing else is going well for you. We also found that video games have a protective effect during the pandemic, because I know even my wife struggled, whereas I actually had my online friends. So it was like, no problem. Like I can't leave the house, like no big deal. I've already got my friends from all over the country that I already play games with. So that there are protective effects. There are social effects, arguably some even effects on IQ. It's not going to make you better at academics, unfortunately. There's a very specific kind of IQ, but we have seen positive effects from video games before. Very understudied though. Very little research money goes to the positive effects of video games.
Absolutely. And we have, before the final question, is it linked also to time in mobiles or cell phones?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whether you're talking about video games or technology addiction, these are different in some ways, but I think in general, they tend to be like pretty similar. So if you look at technology addiction, like doom scrolling on Twitter, or spending time on Facebook, things like that, we know that there are studies that show that those negatively impact your mental health. Doing those kinds of things also suppress your amygdala and your limbic system. Those are the emotional circuits of the brain. So like if you're having a bad day and you look at cat pictures on the internet, like it's going to make you feel better. And people will also get addicted to things like YouTube or social media, right? So I do think that the effects on the brain are slightly different, but a lot of these things apply in general to like screen addiction.
Olivia, ¿tú preguntas? Olivia had another.
¿Seguimos?
Lots
Yes.
of questions, really. So that's
There are
why
lots
we
of
have to-
questions.
Yeah.
This has been
¿Les
repeated
parece-
a couple of times.
¿Les
Let me just
parece si es que seguimos 10 minutos más máximo para después poder entregar la mayor cantidad de tiempo, pero en el fondo también para darle un corte? Olivia?
Okay, thank you. Yes, this it's been repeated a couple of times. We talk about procrastination when kids have to manage the video games addiction. How can parents help in that way, or at, at home, or control the procrastination?
Okay, so here's the thing to understand about games and procrastination. The first is that the video game is a tool that the procrastination uses, right? So if you have someone who's going to procrastinate and you take away the video game, they're going to end up procrastinating somehow else. They'll just watch YouTube instead. Now, video games make it easier to procrastinate because they do, cause you to release dopamine in your brain. So they make procrastination more fun. But if you want to understand procrastination, we've got a good YouTube video about this. Part of the reason that people struggle with procrastination is because there are actually 3 kinds of separate procrastination, which is why someone will come up with one answer, but they're treating the wrong thing. So in medicine, we have a saying that good diagnosis precedes good treatment. There are 3 reasons why people procrastinate. This is a simplification, but I think it's pretty true. The first is there's some kind of emotion at play. So like, for example, we recently had someone in our community ask this question that was, I'm struggling to figure out, I dropped out of college. So during the pandemic, I dropped out of college. My parents think I've been doing online classes. How do I tell them? And they've been lying to their parents for a year. That's procrastination. They need to tell them. So there's some kind of emotional piece that keeps you from doing it. Oh, I need to tell my boss that I made a mistake. I need to tell my, someone that I screwed up. I banged the car, and then you're afraid to tell them, afraid to tell them, afraid to tell them. So in order to overcome avoidance procrastination or emotional procrastination, you have to deal with the underlying emotion. When you manage the underlying emotion, the procrastination will go away. Second reason that people procrastinate is because of perfectionism. So I'm not going to do it until I can do it perfectly, right? So you want to be perfect. And so like, I'm not ready yet. People will become paralyzed. So interestingly enough, in terms of perfectionistic procrastination, what you need to help your child do is recognize that like, you're not going to be perfect, and help them sort of understand that like progress is slow, right? If you failed a class, I know I struggled with this. When I failed a class, when I repeated it, I needed to get an A. That's the only way I can do it, because I have to make up for my failure. But it's hard to go from an F to an A. It's going to be hard to go from F to a C, even doing okay, right? So you have to sort of almost let go of that attachment of like being perfect and acknowledge that, generally speaking, if you look at people who are successful in life, they're not the people who are perfect. They're the people who get 80% of the job done like 95% of the time. That's going to make you more successful than getting 95% of the job done 80% of the time. You can't drop the ball 20% of the time. So helping people sort of frame shift from being perfect to being acceptable to doing less things. And then the third reason that people procrastinate is operational in nature. So this is where sometimes what you need to do is break a big task. A task can feel overwhelming and you have to break it into chunks. So this is where we also see like, doing something like getting my life in order or becoming independent. Like, how do you do that? Finding a girlfriend. How do you find? You can't find a girlfriend. What, I'm walking down the street and I'm going to pick one up? The verb doesn't make sense. You can't find a girlfriend. It involves all of these different tasks. Doing laundry, getting a haircut, shaving, exercising, learning how to talk to people, not living at home anymore. These are all the things that you have to do. So a lot of times our goals are not actually verbs that we can do. They're not actually actions we can take. So we have to break that big task into lots of chunks. Last thing that I'll say about this, you may understand this because if you have a 5-year-old, or let's say you have a 10-year-old, you can tell your 10-year-old clean your room. You can't tell a 2-year-old to clean your room. They don't know where to start. It's too big for them. You can tell your 2-year-old, where does the doggy go? Where does the book go? Where do your shorts go? So you can break an abstract task into smaller things. Especially important for people who play video games, because people who play video games are bad at abstract tasks that need to be broken apart. So sometimes they need help. This is true of ADHD as well. They need help breaking down a big task into its pieces, and that'll help with procrastination. So you may be surprised because your 15-year-old needs to write a paper and they're procrastinating with video games. They may need your help at breaking that problem apart. Okay, first, let's read this chapter. First, let's make an outline. Then let's do this. Then let's do this. Today, I want you to just read these 3 chapters. Don't worry about the rest of the paper. That can help a lot. Great question.
Okay, I've got another one here. There's a lot of research from the Academy of Medicine. They're pushing also in the Senate to have control laws. Control laws. And it's already known that it might be the pandemic of the future. What's your thought about it? And how to live it like in your own flesh?
It's not the pandemic of the future. It's the pandemic of the present. Like it's already a pandemic. And this is where, so some countries have implemented control laws. So South Korea declared video game addiction a public health emergency like 8 or 9 years ago. China in the last year has passed certain laws. So you can't play more than 1 or 2 hours a day, I think, on the weekend if you're under the age of 18. And this is where China is like very, all of your video game accounts are like linked to your national ID. Some people have theorized that this actually isn't going to make much of a difference because most kids have access to their grandparents' national ID. And so the addicts will actually like just use their grandparents' stuff. We really don't know how well that works in implementation. So I do think that some kind of government regulation is necessary, but I tend to find that the regulation that they have in mind tends to not be very sophisticated. So this is where I think maybe what we need to do is instead of just like limiting the total amount of play, which may work, but chances are there are going to be bypasses and stuff like that. That's what we've sort of seen. Instead, I think what companies need, what the government needs to do is really regulate addictive features within video games. That's, I think, where the real answer is. Because as long as there are things like loot boxes and stuff like that, some Scandinavian countries have done this. So Sweden, for example, I think has a law that loot boxes are actually considered gambling, which is true because you can spend real money and then you can even sell items for real money. I got a cosmetic item in a video game that I sold for $600. I was like, what on earth? It's crazy. Someone paid $600 for it. So I think that government regulation definitely needs to come. It's not the pandemic of the future. It's the pandemic of the present. It's been around for a little while. We've just been more worried about other pandemics. Great question.
Yeah, there's a question that's I think a lot of people is normally thinking, and is there a risk that they can, children or youngsters or people can replicate in game behavior in real life? Do you think that can happen? For example, harming others, or I don't know, becoming more violent or something like that?
Yeah, so a lot of people are concerned that playing violent video games makes people more violent. This is where, thankfully, people have been worried about it for a while, and there's a lot of research about it. And the short answer is not really. So we know that sometimes playing a video game increases feelings of aggression. And you'll see that with your kid, because when they're playing a game, they get in a really nasty mood. But the link to actually performing violence is quite low. And this is where I just like think about it, right? Like, so if you watch how many of y'all have seen violent movies or violent TV shows? And how many of y'all are out there? Like, if you watch a bunch of murder mysteries, are you like out there murdering people? Like, I don't think so. So I mean, hopefully not, right? Whereas thankfully, what we're really talking about is feelings of resentment and anger and aggression, but they don't really translate into behavior the way that a lot of people are worried about. Some studies will show a relatively small link, but if you look at meta-analyses, generally speaking, the effect size is almost nothing or quite small.
Perfect. So really the main concern would be what happens to the person that's playing the games, but not in real life, but on these other things that we have been talking about, right?
Yeah. So there are isolated cases of real life violence that are related to video games, but those are so rare that they're like, you'll see news articles and stuff. But if you think about it, so just understand this, 99% of people under the age of 30 are playing video games, and most of them are not violent. Thankfully, it's something you don't have to worry much about.
Oh, perfect. Thank God.
The one thing.
Yeah, at least one thing. So I don't know, Daniel, do you want to ask something else? Because really there's so many questions that I don't know what to know.
Bueno, como explicó antes el doctor K, esa es la idea, ¿no? Poder expresar preguntas para poder conocer bien a la otra parte. Y eso hoy día lo que yo creo que estamos haciendo. Estamos tratando de abrir nuevos canales, nuevas formas de diálogo, para conocer mejor a nuestro hijo o hija y finalmente poder entregar este mensaje que es tan relevante e importante, que es que los videojuegos en verdad no son solamente un juego y que tiene quizás una de las implicancias más graves y más potentes, que es que nos pueden sacar del foco de nuestra vida real. Y me quiero quedar con una frase y después ya le doy el turno a Dr. K para que cierre. Le dice que las personas que valoran, que quieren su vida real, que están motivados con lo que hacen, automáticamente baja la intensidad con que juegan. Y creo que ese es un punto fundamental, porque si hay algo que podemos hacer como papás, como educadores, como mamás, es poder darle mayor relevancia al mundo offline que al online. Y eso me parece que se puede hacer en todas partes. A eso apuntan todos programas, las competencias, las habilidades que podemos desarrollar. Y con ello, que un mensaje quizá un poco personal, me gustaría dar la posibilidad para hacer las 9:30, para poder cerrar, agradecer obviamente a Fernanda, a Olivia, a Mónica, la intérprete, pero también al Dr. K, y poder pedirle que si puede cerrar quizás con un mensaje, y obviamente agradecerle a todos y a todas las que hoy día nos acompañaron. Dr. K, por favor.
Before that, sorry.
Yeah, so I would love to. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I think it's, people were asking, is it the pandemic of the future? And I think everyone's presence here today signals that it's the pandemic of the present. The good news is that we do have tools that can overcome this. I think the reason that it's grown so big is because we've let it grow without trying anything. So a lot of parents out there will be completely hopeless. I also saw there was recently a question about, what about kids on the autism spectrum and things like that, where like for a long time, we've just let this thing grow without any kind of like effort or control on a systematic sense. The good news is we've seen overwhelmingly positive results at Healthy Gamer. That's why we've grown so rapidly. And like I said, we reach 2 to 5 million people, and those aren't parents predominantly, they're your kids. So the good news is that your kids actually recognize that there's a problem. The majority of them. If you've got an 8-year-old, it's a little bit different, right? They may not know. But this is the kind of thing where thankfully with a lot of love, a lot of patience, and some direction, we can take all of the energy that you have as a parent and just direct it with a little bit more sophistication, a little bit more precision. And what we see is parents and children coming together, having really strong relationships, and kids really thanking their parents for doing this for them. And it goes back to that one story that I sort of mentioned, where the parent asks the kid, 1 hour before your class, when you don't want to go and you want to play a video game, do you want me to force you? And the kid says, yes, Dad, please, absolutely. And then, 2 days later, I hated it in the moment, but thank you so much for making me go. And so that's really what we can build if we work towards it. So thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here.
Dr. K, por último, que ahí vi que se refirió, pero quizás para algunas personas es muy importante. Si puede explicar un poquito más y explayarse, y con esto cerramos con el espectro autista y los videojuegos. Como que no quedó muy claro en su posición frente a ello, para poder, digamos, cerrar y que creo que por la condición en verdad
Sure.
es importante reforzar ese mensaje.
Yeah. So autism is challenging, first of all, because it's not homogeneous, right? So we call it autism spectrum disorder because some people will struggle in some ways, some people will struggle in different ways. One thing that we know is that there's a high comorbidity between a video game addiction and autism spectrum, in general, technology usage. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of what people on the autism spectrum struggle with is social connection and empathy. So they have difficulty like with reading body language, they have difficulty reading the room, whereas online interactions can feel a lot more safe and comfortable. So in that way, video games or online communities can be very helpful to people with autism. Our community, for example, has a high amount of people with autism. And at the same time, it's also like more challenging in a lot of ways because these people, if we're talking about the goal, the ultimate antidote to video game addiction is building a life that is worth living. That challenge can be harder for people on the autism spectrum. In terms of how to navigate that, this is somewhere where, unfortunately, it's like really hard to provide general advice because I've seen so much variation. So it's really about understanding how does autism make living your life more challenging and really having very, very targeted solutions. And it's challenging. It's absolutely doable. But that's where, you know, a lot of what we teach at Healthy Gamer, or even things like communication seminars, we'll teach people how to socialize. We've got something in the works where we're going to teach people how to flirt, right? So what we're sort of seeing is as people spend more and more time online, they're losing track of these skills and it's hard for them to reintegrate. So we teach a lot of this basic stuff around procrastination, communication, how to have a conversation, how to be a good listener. And we teach this to parents too, because what we're noticing is that the job of a parent is harder than it used to be. It's hard enough to talk to your kids, but now when they're stuck in the video game, it's like become even harder. So autism spectrum, unfortunately, is something that does make things more challenging. Games can be a really good escape for people with autism. And you really have to really figure out what are the unique challenges that a particular person with autism faces and how can we supplement those, because that has to happen in order to reintegrate them into the rest of life.
Muchas gracias. Ahí queda entonces, creo, bien. Olivia, Mónica, Fernanda, nuevamente le agradecemos, Dr. K, a cada uno y una que atendió, que participó, que con sus preguntas obviamente hicieron mucho más interesante esta oportunidad de conocimiento. Le agradecemos muchísimo en nombre de todos. Así que esperamos.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here. Love the questions. And you know, y'all will figure this out. It's okay. Believe in yourselves. You'll get this. Take care, everyone.
Muchas gracias. Que les vaya muy bien.
Bye,
Muchas
thank
gracias.
you so much.
Bye, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. K.
Bye.